Hello and welcome to the India Today, Business Today studio here at Davos for Brainstorm 2026 at the World Economic Forum, and with me, Kimberley Botwright, the head of the Center for Trade and Geopolitics at the World Economic Forum. Kimberley, welcome to our studio here. This is a very, very interesting and fascinating time for analysts and experts like you and for journalists like us to be discussing what's happening in the world, particularly in your area of expertise, which is trade. For the folks who are tuning into this conversation, how would you describe this moment in global trade? Completely fragmented, the old era over, and a new uncertain multipolar bilateral trade alignment in the works?
Good question. What we can see, especially, we've released a flagship report called our Global Collaboration Barometer. And to go directly to your question, what we see there is that the architecture of international trade is changing. Multilateralism facing some headwinds, to be sure, but we're seeing also, interestingly, the rise of minilateral and plurilateral deals. We also released our Chief Economist's Outlook last Friday, and therein you see that chief economists expect 94% of them expect to see a continued acceleration of bilateral trade agreements, whereas 64% of them expect to see an acceleration of regional trade agreements, which I think really demonstrates where we will see, or how we will see the rules of trade evolving going forward.
You know, in India, we would obviously be interested and are interested in what happens with our US negotiations or with the European Union. But give us a sense of the global trade realignments. Are many other countries trying to protect their interests and getting into one-on-one deals, given what the United States is doing for the past year or around that time?
What I think we see is, going back again, we are noting a strong rise in regional trade agreements. Just last weekend, we see the EU and Mercosur concluding a deal. But I also want to note that the nature of what is traded is changing. So we're seeing a continued acceleration, for example, of digital trade. So it's not just about goods trade today, it's also about the delivery of services online and also across borders through digital means. For example, digitally delivered services had a 6% increase last year compared to only about a 2.4% increase in merchandise trade. And so there, I think it's interesting to see that some regions are also negotiating specific rules to encourage that type of trade. For example, the ASEAN group of nations have recently concluded a digital economy framework agreement, which was quite exciting, and we ran some dialogue to help provide some insights on what would be most useful in that area.
Tell us about the highlights and the unique features of this digital pact that you are talking about.
Yeah, so a digital economy framework agreement, what that does is it looks at things like, for example, e-payments. How can it be easier to do cross-border e-payments? Also, another important topic is how do we have or reduce friction between different countries' data laws? Now, obviously, countries need to regulate their data. How do we have some degree of interoperability around that? Also, for example, looking at the delivery when you have the mix between, or the blend between digital and physical e-commerce. What can be done there to make sure that customs can also cope with the increased rate of packages that is going to bring on?
Absolutely. As a consumer, digital technologies mean I can research and be ready to buy using electronic payments, basically goods from anywhere in the world. That was perhaps not so possible 10 years or 20 years ago. So that's a very good point, will serve consumer interest. I wonder if you've had occasion to look at the BRICS agenda for promoting digital payments, cross-border digital payments amongst the BRICS countries. Is that something that you have looked at, and is it significant, and how does that fit into the overall subject that you just spoke about?
Speak to the BRICS specifically. What I can tell you is another region that's also pursuing a regional trade agreement or implementing a regional trade agreement is the African continent. There's an African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It has a digital trade protocol. It'll be doing similar things, again, looking at that digital infrastructure that's needed to enable that kind of business activity digital business activity across borders. And it's also worth saying, these conversations will continue here in Davos this week. We have over 50 high-level political figures from Brazil, India, China, and South Africa joining us. So we're delighted about that.
Let's shift the focus to supply chains. For the average person around the world who may not be involved in the subject, supply chains and rare earth became a subject dominating headlines over the past couple of years. The world seems to have woken up very late to the dangers of concentration of supply and supply deals which have been locked in over a multi-decadal framework, and this is disrupting the advancement of certain technologies, including in the electric vehicle space, even for a country like India. For those economies which haven't locked themselves into this, is there any hope that there could be a fairer sort of arrangement globally with regard to supplies in this area?
So when we talk about supply chains, we often talk about the distance that something physically travels in a supply chain, and that can be a factor of competitiveness. It is also interesting to look at geopolitical distance, if you will. So that means what we're seeing now is that countries that are maybe a bit more geopolitically aligned are trading more with each other. And to reassure, we are still seeing trade between geopolitically distant countries. So it's not like the world is fully fragmenting in its supply chains. But nonetheless, there is a bit more of a sense of friendshoring. I think we're seeing that come up more. Though, last point that I'll make here is that mid-aligned economies, ASEAN, Brazil, India, there we see the geopolitical distance of trade isn't changing. We're seeing there that the doors are being kept open, and we see these business are making sure to keep their options open in their supply chains.
That's an interesting point, because the geopolitical distance term that you use, India and China are next to each other, and therefore the geopolitical distance, the geographical distance is in fact minimal, but geopolitically the distance is very, very significant. So that's a good point that you make. Explain to us how you see India's ability and its economic size being able to allow it to play a significant role in the global realignment that is happening in this space. Do you think more needs to be done as far as Indian policy is concerned?
India is such a big player, as you've highlighted. And so as this global architecture shifts around trade, around many other areas of governance, it's vital that India is part of those conversations. And so we are pleased to have many representatives from states in India here with us for those conversations.
Okay. China, again, I don't know about how close you look at that subject, but China's role in the past 2-3 years also seems to have evolved from being the supplier of goods, at least a very significant supplier, to also denying technology. For instance, one of the very largest corporations in India hasn't been able to proceed ahead with a lithium battery plant because of denial of technology. There's denial of supplies, there's denial of heavy machinery. Is that a risk factor especially for large private corporations in emerging economies which want to look at these newer economy areas?
I'll give you a statistic to answer that. We've done another report where we interviewed over 50 corporations on how they are building up their geopolitical capacity. How prepared are they to handle that kind of evolution in international architecture? And only 1 in 5 of the companies we interviewed do have a geopolitical function reporting into the C-suite. I think given a more complex environment, our president and CEO will say one of the most complex geopolitical environments we've seen lately, we might see more companies building up that function and that capacity, because it's not something we've seen today.
What should that be called? Chief Crisis Officer?
So in the 1 in 5, in the 20% that do have that function, there are a variety of different names for it. Some have sort of a center, very few, but they'll have a group that will look after this. Some will have a senior advisor. Some will have someone who's more operating to coordinate across different functions, whether that's supply chain, legal, government affairs. So we see a few different models for this.
It's interesting you spoke about that because Indian IT companies, and this is half in jest, recently have felt the need to have a chief H-1B visa officer to deal with some of the complexities. But let's look ahead, and what should the playbook be for emerging economies, not just India, but on a broader basis, to deal with the Trumpian world trade order as we are seeing it develop?
Key is dialogue. That is why we have this theme for our annual meeting, the spirit of dialogue. We can't find solutions, and there can't be ways to identify new forms of prosperity, seizing new opportunities that are coming up, whether that's through the digital economy or solving shared challenges like climate change, without first coming to the table and having a conversation. So that's really why we had that as a theme for the annual meeting this year.
What about climate change with the US pulling back? Tell our viewers, especially in India, and we are very concerned with climate change. What about the rest of the world? Is the rest of the world, particularly the European Union, still on track with its goals and objectives to mitigate climate change?
I like statistics so far. Yeah. So last year we saw investment in green areas of the economy still continue to hit global highs. In the first half of last year, there was about 386 billion invested in the energy transition. That was a 10% year-on-year increase. I think that demonstrates there's still a lot of investor interest and momentum, including really putting the capital flow into where industry transformation needs to happen.
So there's no reversal really that you see in 2026 or beyond that?
I think we'll have to look at the data and the capital flows to assess that. So we'll have to keep an eye on the data and whether that capital flow moves. Capital flow, investment in industrial transformation is really where we will see if we're able to make that shift to a more low carbon economy.
As we wrap up this conversation, Boge Brende was talking about 2026, and he said that he expects uncertainty to perhaps continue into 2027 because of various factors. What's your own sense about the trade policy realignment? Is there an end game that we foresee, and corporations who have to deal with these changes, especially multinationals, will be able to say, okay, another 4 quarters of disruption and then things will settle down?
I take a long view. I'm working on trade for a while. I think trade and trade negotiations have always evolved. They always have. Every year there's a new zeitgeist that's informing the conversation. So I do think that we will need companies and all parts of society to be constantly monitoring how the situation on trade evolves, and then understanding what types of functions they need in their business to understand that and continue to do business in that environment.
How would you therefore describe it if I would ask you to frame it with a phrase? So, if market access was the initial wave of the WTO and starting with GATT, or even prior to that the Dunkel draft, what term could capture it for our viewers?
I'm going to go with plurilateralism. I talked about minilateralism and plurilateralism. I think we're moving into a world where a lot will move forward by coalitions of the willing, where they want to negotiate market access, and maybe not everyone is involved, but those that will still go forward. That need not be, however, mutually exclusive to multilateralism. I do think the two can sit in parallel. So I guess we'll see a hierarchy maybe, or a kind of
and that
multipolarity.
And plurilateralism, as you describe it, will the driving factor be geopolitical interests and geopolitical and strategic interests, security interests, more than economic interests?
I think it will be both.
Oh, it will be both. Okay, that's a good term to for us to mull over, because viewers, I've been here for the last 4 or 5 outings, and every year the World Economic Forum comes up with a theme that is relevant to its time. 3 years, 4 years ago, it was China +1, and from an Indian perspective, we were thinking that the world will look at India as an alternative supply destination. Now India is looking at multiple alternatives, because one of the arrangements with the United States seems to be a bit under pressure, but we remain hopeful on that front. Kimberley, thank you so much. for your time with us. We wrap up this conversation here. We'll continue our coverage here from Davos Brainstorm from our studios. Do stay tuned in. Until then, goodbye.
We kick off the third leg of BT Golf from here in Bengaluru.